Brownsville and doesn't go to UVA? Welcome to the greatest university in the world. National championship basketball team. Magic started. It's amazing. Anyway, so we're going to talk about epistles here. All right. So when I first started looking at exegesis and biblical interpretation, it honestly really changed the way that I looked at the Bible. And I was in high school, and I was like trying to figure things out in terms of like my spirituality and whether or not I believed the Bible. And like I wasn't even a disciple yet. And like looking back, it's very weird. I asked my parents for a bunch of like Bible study tools for like Christmas, including the required readings. Oh! How to read the Bible for all it's worth. It was like the one year my parents like bought me everything on my Christmas list. Because they were like, yes, like we are definitely going to encourage this. Yeah, exactly. But once I started actually reading the Bible the way it was meant to be read, once I started reading the Bible the way that the people it was written for read it, it just blew my mind.
Amen.
And I think just seeing the Bible from the perspective of the people it was written for really gave it weight. And something I want to really encourage us to do as a part of this class is to read the Bible with our head but also our hearts. And that can kind of be difficult to separate those two things. But one thing I want to encourage us to do is to read the Bible with humility. And kind of put away our biases, put away our expectations about what the Word means. Put that all aside and really see it for what it is. Really see it how God wants us to see it. And to do that, we have to look at the Bible logically. We have to look at these things from a very objective perspective and kind of say, okay, forget what I feel about this. What does this say? Let me just accept the conclusions as they come to me, as I really engage the Word. But something happens when we read the Bible the way it was meant to be read. Something happens when we really engage the context historically. When we really see, what the people of the time were thinking, what the writers of the time were thinking, when we really empathize with their position, the Word really gets flesh and bones added on top of it. And that is when the Word becomes powerful.
Amen.
Because then we can really see, wow, these were real people. When Jesus becomes a real figure, that's when he's powerful. When Paul becomes a real human, that's when it becomes powerful. And so I want us to be able to put aside our biases, think about this logically, but also as a consequence of engaging the Word in that way, let it hit us powerfully. And put ourselves in the shoes of the author and the audience. And something I also want us to be able to do is to be able to ask the right questions. This is not a class about me giving you all the answers. No one here is going to be able to do that. We don't have time to cover all the problem passages of the Bible. We don't have time to cover every single book. But really what I want you guys to be able to leave here with is the ability to ask and answer your own questions. Ask the right questions about the text we're reading, and then be able to get answers from them. So, before we move on, who can tell me what an epistle is? What is an epistle? This class is going to be effective. Nice. Yeah.
Is it like a letter?
Yes, it is like a letter. Perfect. So, every New Testament book between Romans and Jude, everything after Acts, before Revelation, is an epistle. And they're written by various authors. Most of them are written by Paul, some by John, Peter, Jude, but they exist on a scale of very personal to very impersonal. Some of them are literally addressed to a single person. Some of them are addressed to a specific church. Some are addressed to a group of churches. And some are kind of addressed more generally to a larger body of believers. And that really does affect the way we read them. And it affects the context in which we read them. And a consequence of the nature of them being letters is that they're highly occasional. And what this means is that they were written for a specific occasion. They were written for a problem to address a situation. So there's almost a question that exists before the letter that the letter is answering. And that's important because we really have to understand what that question is, what the problems are, if we're going to understand the letter to begin with. If we're going to understand the answer, we need that context. And everything that Drew was talking about in terms of historical context, that's important to engage. Knowing who these people were. When we're going to read 1 Thessalonians together as a group, knowing, okay, where is Thessalonica? Who were these people? Sometimes it's worth knowing, okay, what did the people do for a living? What was the main source of economy? You know, what would have been like for them? What kind of problems would they have faced in the society? Really informs our understanding of the answer of the epistle. Because a lot of the things that are written in the epistles only make sense if you know why they're being written. And so we need to be able to think contextually. And to illustrate this, this is a text conversation between me and my good friend Will Portillo. And it starts out, you know, pretty normal. And we're just going to get one side. We're basically just going to get my side of this conversation at first. And I started by asking, all right, want to get lunch this week? Then I said, after Will said something, oh, amen. Is she okay? So it brings about a few questions about what's happening on the other side of this conversation. You might be able to assume maybe Will's not able to get lunch this week. Someone might not be okay. There's a she involved. Who is she? We don't know. That's a big question. Who is she? I'm guessing she doesn't live here. It might be a long distance she. We don't know. It brings up more questions. We kind of have to ask, okay, what is Stephen really talking about here? Haha! I mean, it would have been kind of hilarious if she lived there and you hadn't seen her in 5 years, and suddenly you had to go see her this week for no reason.
Wow.
Now it's very confusing. Has someone not been seen for 5 years? Was this a joke? Is this not a joke? And finally, oh shoot, I forgot Grandma at the bingo hall 5 years ago. There's a lot of questions that you probably have about this, and for good reason. Out of context, this does not make a lot of sense. All right? We don't really know what's happening here. Once we begin filling out the rest of the conversation, see what happens. Want to get lunch this week? Can't this week. I'm going home Thursday and Friday to visit my grandma. She is grandma. All right. He can't have lunch because he's out of town visiting she, who is grandma. Oh, amen. Is she okay? Yeah, I just haven't seen her in like 5 years. Which brings up a question. To which I said, I'm guessing she doesn't live here. And Will says, no, haha, she's visiting my parents in Virginia Beach, so I'm heading there. To which my response was, haha, I mean, it would have been kind of hilarious if she had lived there and you hadn't seen her in 5 years and suddenly you had to go see her this week for no reason. Expressing my confusion and now my understanding of the situation, Will says, lol. It'd be like, oh yeah, I have a grandma. And then I said, oh shoot, I forgot Grandma at the bingo hall. Now, the context of this really allows us to understand here. You know, we understand that at the end, that's clearly a joke, given the context. No one actually said, I forgot Grandma at the bingo hall 5 years ago and didn't pick her up. And so, knowing the context even lets us understand sometimes what is figurative, sometimes what is literal, allows us to see the entire conversation. Context is so important. But before we kind of go on, we're going to look at some hazards of interpreting epistles.
Amen.
One of these, and these hazards, you know, we really have to ask ourselves, all right, what do we need to apply and what can we leave alone? You know, kind of what Drew was saying, this idea of historical particularity or things that exist for all time. And something that's important to understand for the epistles is that in that they are occasional and in that they are letters, they are not usually these grand theological statements for all time. Paul doesn't write his letters thinking, okay, everyone is going to read this forever. I need to sum up the entirety of my theology in one piece so that people can read this and nothing else and understand the point of the gospel. And this brings up an idea of something called task theology, which is there is theology in the epistles, but every epistle is not a self-contained like statement for all time. It's task theology. And that means Paul pulls out bits of his theology to address certain situations. It's theology with a point. It's theology with an application.
Nice.
And that's why we need to understand why Paul is saying these things, so we understand, okay, why is he saying this particular theology here? Why does he leave out other things? It's because he's addressing a specific situation. And the absence of something in one letter doesn't mean that it's not applicable elsewhere.
Right.
And that brings up this idea of common particulars. And something that Drew said, the first rule of exegetics and hermeneutics, or the idea of bringing the word into the 21st century and applying it to ourselves in the 21st century, is this idea of common particulars. And something that Drew said was, the word cannot mean to us what it did not mean to them.
Amen.
We need to understand what it meant to them, read it on their level, given the context. And when we understand why what was said, then we can apply it to ourselves. And when the particulars of a situation are common to us, when we share the struggles of the church that Paul is writing to, then we can apply that to ourselves. All right? When Paul is talking about head coverings in church, he's talking to a specific situation. It's distracting, the way that the Corinthians are dressing, the things that they're doing. Some of those particulars don't really apply to us when, a woman doesn't cover her hair in church. It's not really distracting for us. None of you women right now really have your heads covered, except for Jenna. Well done, Jenna.
Let's go, Jenna!
Oh, and Laura. Laura's got a scarf on.
Oh,
Hello,
nice.
Laura.
Also Laura. Hello, Laura.
Yes.
Amen. When the particulars are similar for them and us, then the word can be applied to us. Then the principle actually does blow our way. It is applicable for us. Another hazard is the idea of cultural relativity. And this brings up a couple points, is that we have cultural bias, and that the churches to which Paul was writing and the other authors of the New Testament, they had a culture themselves that is very different from ours. So one of the things we have to be careful of is we can't let our cultural bias sway us.
Amen.
Right? We can't say that just because something is okay in our society means that it's okay for us to do as disciples. We also can't explain away passages due to cultural relativity. To say, okay, well, that was in their culture, so we don't need to do that for us. We need to understand what are the common particulars here. And one of the questions that we have to ask is, where does the Bible bear uniform witness, and in what cultural context is Paul making his point? So when the Bible is very clear across the board on something, it's a pretty good sign that it transcends culture.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good sign that, because Paul was writing to people in very different places. All the New Testament writers were writing to people in very different places. They had a similar culture, but there were different particulars. And when the New Testament bears uniform witness on something, when across the board the writers of the New Testament agree, that transcends cultural relativity. That is for all time. Something that's also very important to think about is, okay, in what cultural context is Paul making his point? Because sometimes he says things that go along with the culture at the time. Sometimes he contradicts the culture wholesale. Especially, when we think about things like sexual immorality and stuff like that. Paul was living in a time when sexual promiscuity was not really frowned upon by most people in Greco-Roman culture. So when Paul says things like, flee from sexual immorality, he's really going against the grain here. And when he takes a hard stance on something that is anti-cultural at the time, we need to really listen to that. Because sometimes we can explain away it's not a big deal, this is just the way things are. When Paul says flee from sexual morality, he's saying in a culture that's actually similar to our own and going against the grain there. That's something that we need to take very seriously,
Amen.
Given that context. Amen. Something I want you all to do is get your phones and take a picture of this, because we're not going to really go over this. This is the process of exegesis that Gordon Fee goes over in his book. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. I don't want to leave out Stewart. Very important guy. Do this in your free time. Okay? So something that they encourage you to do is read the entire book of the Bible, read the entire letter in one sitting. And that can be kind of daunting for something like 1 Corinthians or Romans, where it's like over 10 chapters. But it really is important in understanding the whole theme of the book.
Yeah.
This is how these letters would have been read during the day. They would have been brought up to the church. The church in Corinth would have gotten the letter. They would have read that entire thing all the way in one sitting. That is how Paul meant it to be read. That is how we really should read it if we want to understand the whole thing in context and have the whole argument hit us. So before we do that, historical research. Look up the city in question. in your Bible study tool, if you have a commentary, read the intro to a commentary for helpful context. Again, read the whole book in one sitting to get an overall feel for the purpose and the argument. And then separate the book into sections. Don't worry about chapters and headings. So those are very arbitrary, if you did not know that. Headings in the Bible are great to kind of find things quickly. Chapters and verses are great to be able to explain quickly where something is. But those are not inspired necessarily. So something you want to do when you read an epistle is say, okay, if I wasn't looking at this from a chapter and verse perspective, where would I kind of draw the lines and where the writer shifts his argument? What are the sections that I see where the argument shifts, that these different ideas are parsed out? And then when you have those different sections, they say read each section twice, at least twice, use a different translation, and then write down everything you can find about the recipients, the author, and the occasion, list keywords, themes, and repeated phrases, and then paragraph by paragraph, like Drew was saying, answer what is the author saying and why he says it here. Something you'll realize as you do this is that the writers of the New Testament had a purpose for how they structured things, and there's something actually very powerful in that. And ask yourself, why does the writer say this here?
Nice.
Because sometimes it's important, it's like we understand, okay, why he said this, it's important to flee from sexual immorality. Why does he say it in this part of this section of the entire book? That's when we really start to get an idea of how the author was thinking. Why does he say this before this? How does this set up his next point? This is really when we begin to build a deep understanding of the word. So, something we're going to do here is we're going to split up into groups and we're going to start exegeting 1 Thessalonians. Nice, we're doing great on time. This is beautiful.
Come on.
All
right.
We're going to split up into groups, and I've kind of done the historical research for you, but you can go onto the ISBE. I just wanted to save us some time so we could really get into the wording and get cracking on reading the text for itself. Basically, the historical context of 1 Thessalonians. The ISBE says, we learn that Thessalonica is a port city, it's the capital of Macedonia, and go ahead and take a picture of the rest of this and bring it out when you are reading this for yourself, because this may or may not be helpful based on what section you're reading. But go ahead and, if you have a Bible, turn over to Acts 17. We're going to read this together.
Let's go, Stephen.
Come on, Stephen.
And something that's very important when reading epistles is to go back, and if there's a relevant section of Acts, go ahead and read that. What's beautiful about Thessalonians is that Paul actually went there. And his experience in Thessalonica was recorded. And so it's a beautiful thing because we actually get to see what life was like before the letter was written. What was going on that kind of sparked Paul to write this? Could I actually get someone to stand up and read Acts 17, 1 through 9? Will Portillo.
Come on,
wow,
Will.
we're going to hear from the man himself. The man with the grandma.
It says, when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason out and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they have made Jesus and the others post bond and let them go.
You read verse 10 as well.
Yeah. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Will. So, Paul goes to Thessalonica, is preaching the word, and this stirs up a bit of trouble. All right, And they end up getting kicked out, basically. Some of the believers are arrested because of what Paul is preaching. They're dragged before the city officials. They have to pay a fine. It says that the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. They made them pay a fine and then they let them go. And then Paul and his companions were basically forced by the believers to leave in the dead of night because they were afraid of what was going to happen to them. So, asking a few questions of this text, and actually this is, you guys can respond to these by raising your hand. Why is Paul's departure here problematic? What kind of problems would this raise that Paul has to leave so suddenly? Yeah, Bob.
Problems for the reader or problems for the Thessalonians?
Problems for the Thessalonians. Yeah. Why would this have been problematic for the church? Yeah.
They're leaderless after only having been in church for a short amount of time.
Yes. Imagine you were reached out to on campus, and then a bunch of people were baptized. 4 weeks later, that guy is gone. All right. What kind of problems might that bring up? What's that?
Wilson, what do we do?
There would be some confusion, right? There would be a lot of confusion. There wouldn't be a lot of time for training, right? What kind of things might you be feeling if that was the case? Sorry, I heard something?
Insecurity.
Insecurity. Yeah. You have your hand?
Yeah. What if the wrong Thessalonian decides I'm going to take charge?
Yeah.
It could go sideways.
Yeah, for sure. Insecurity in leadership. Like, do we really know enough to be able to live this out, Drew?
Kind of feeling like maybe abandoned. Like, why did our leader abandon us?
Yeah, 100%. It'd be discouraging. It'd be hard at that point, right? Yeah. This is the context in which Paul is writing this letter. And we'll see from reading it that this is very much on Paul's mind. This context right here. Keep this in mind. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to split into groups. There's going to be 4 groups. All right? And we're going to split these sections. What you're going to do in your group is you're going to read the whole book out loud. All right? So split it up, but you're going to read it all in one sitting. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take one of these sections, read it again. Maybe read it in a different translation. All right? Then what you're going to do as that's happening is list the points where context is revealed. Clues about the occasion, what prompted the writing of this letter, what is Paul's situation as he's writing this letter, what are his attitudes towards the situation, towards the believers, and what's the audience's situation, and what are their attitudes. Then you're going to ask, what is Paul saying? So you're going to sum up his main point or argument in this section. All right, so what is the main thing that he's saying? And then answer, why does he say this? Why does Paul write this? What is his intent in writing this? And why does he put it here at this point in this letter? Then after you do that, we'll have kind of fleshed out the whole context. You're going to then move on to application. How can we apply what Paul is saying? What situations might this apply to? And then bonus question, is there a situation where this passage could be misused without exegesis? So if we hadn't gone through this process, what are some ways that someone might potentially misuse this passage? So we're going to go ahead and number off 1 to 4 to make sure that we have 4 even groups. All right, so we're going to go start here. We're going to snake around. All right.